Hello. Hello, welcome, to the final presentation of EDGE City program. I'm Peter Trummer, and for the last 2 years, I somehow coordinate this program. But my introduction will be very short because most of the work that you're going to see is the work that the students have developed with Matthew. In order to give a little introduction, the idea was when David asked how to set up a program, it was an idea to engage with the reality of the production of architecture within the city at large. Even when in a first beginning the students go through a series of design projects, it was in the end the aim to develop a thesis with an engagement of the real. Now, why, of course, it is interesting to get Matthew, because honestly, Matthew was the secret person who gave actually the larger thesis behind the program, because I think when David once met him a couple of years ago on a conference, he called me up and said, listen, I think there is someone who really has a really interesting project on the city, and he has written then in that time a text on zombie urbanism, which shows how flows of capital engage within the production of architecture. So in that sense, what has been asked now to the students was, when they did with me something in the summer as a design exercise, that basically then Matthew came in last year and more this year to take them on their individual project and develop out of them a kind of individual thesis. Yeah? And so in that sense, I think everything we're seeing, I give over to Matthew, because he will then describe with you the content of what you're going to see today. In that, it's a pleasure, and thank you very much, and have a nice, enjoy your day.
Thanks, Peter. So thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm just going to describe the format for today, or start with the format. So basically, all the work that we're going to look at is in videos. So we're going to look at 6 videos, 1 video per student. They range from about 2 minutes to 4 minutes in length, so they're quite short videos. You could describe the content of the videos as really a kind of hybrid of 3 kind of modes of consideration. The first is really just sort of research documentation. The second is sort of journalistic observations, we might say. And the third, more speculative proposals. So each video is a kind of combination of those 3 ingredients. You're going to see a range of the degree to which emphasis is on each of those 3 ingredients. So some of the videos will be more research documentation, some will be a little bit more proposal, a little more gas on the proposal, and some will be a little bit, or like we could say, a sort of equal part of all 3 of those ingredients. The hope is that the videos stand alone on their own merits. So we're just going to show the videos. We're not going to have the students do any sort of didactic description or explanatory narrative to go along with the work. So we have six videos, and what we're going to do is we're going to show 2 videos back to back, and then intersperse it with discussion. So we'll have first 2 videos, discussion, next 2 videos, discussion, last 2 videos, and discussion. And the discussion is really just an open free-for-all, hoping that it's a lively exploration of issues and topics that are sort of emerged through the work, and that it generates in our thinking. So I'll just introduce the panel today. And since there's a lot of you, I want to make sure I get all of you, and I'm going to do it very briefly. So, and this is just by alphabetical order. So at 4 p.m., she's not here yet, Frances Anderton will be joining us. She is the host of the KCRW radio show, DNA, Design and Architecture. We have Johan Bettum from Städelschule in Frankfurt. We have Joe Day, who is a theory faculty member here at SCI-Arc and also principal of Deegan Day here in Los Angeles. We have John Enright. Where's John? Of course, Vice Director and Chair, Academic Officer here at SCI-Arc. We have David Erdman from Pratt Institute in New York. Thank you so much for being here, Chair of the postgraduate programs. We have Eric Ganoyu, here, SCI-Arc member, and also, it should be said, has taught the theory seminar that has gone along with this sort of studio thesis work. So Eric's imprint is here. We have Marcelin Go. Where is Marcelin? Also here, faculty at SCI-Arc. Thank you so much for being here. We have Ferda Kolatan coming from Penn. Thank you so much for being here. David Rue, of course, the director of the postgraduate EDGE programs here at SCI-Arc. And Marika Trotter, history and theory coordinator at SCI-Arc. Is she here? She's here. And Michael Young from New York City, my brain is spacing out, from Cooper Union. And Michael Osman, recently the director of PhD, newly appointed position, head of the PhD programs at UCLA. And sitting in the audience, we have Tom Main, who needs no sentences to go after his name. So before we jump into the work, I just want to say a really brief kind of statement. Did I miss anybody? I think I got everybody. So I want to just say a very brief statement. And let's just say it's a conceptual umbrella or conceptual territory that all the students worked within. I think I got them. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you. So I want to start with saying this. In the opening lines of his 1994 book, The Long 20th Century, Italian sociologist Giovanni Arrighi writes, "Over the last quarter of a century, something fundamental seems to have changed in the way in which capitalism works." Now, that's a pretty straightforward statement, right? But from the vantage of 2018, we could say, yeah, that's accurate, but it also seems like a radical understatement. Indeed, it is possible to argue that the single most important socioeconomic transformation of the last 4 decades is the hegemonic rise of finance capitalism. Now, what's finance capitalism? Finance capitalism prefaces the pursuit of profit from transactions of and investment in financial instruments, such as currency and stocks, as well as commodities such as gold and oil. It subordinates processes of production as a means to generate profit by replacing them with processes of investment. By definition, it is contrasted with industrial capitalism, in which profits are pursued through the production of goods to be sold at markup. So of course, industrial capitalism continues to exist alongside finance capitalism, but let's say all the students are working within a kind of conceptual milieu that seeks to understand the sort of unique dimensions on urbanism that finance capitalism and its immense power in contemporary culture places on cities and architectural space. So we could say, while the components of cities, property, buildings, and their subdivided increments have long functioned, at least in part, as assets to invest in, finance capitalism tends to amplify this function, and in the process impacts the physical form, organization, and operation of cities. This occurs because real estate is one of the primary operative mediums of finance capitalism. And as such, we can say that urban and architectural space is undergoing a process of financialization, which Saskia Sassen refers to as the financialization of non-financial entities. So architecture historically being understood primarily as a non-financial entity, you know, that has to do with habitation, cultural values, and whatnot. And we could say in the last 4 decades, it's sort of transformed to operate more as a financial asset. So, and through this process, a myriad of emergences occur, producing a novel spatio-financial milieu. So I'm going to end very, very soon. Ghost urbanisms, from Chinese new towns to Spanish ensanches, scarcely inhabited pencil towers, mortgage-backed securities, real estate investment trust, the growing practice of ultra-high net worth individuals storing wealth in architectural formations, city investment rankings and metrics, property technology that is remaking use and ownership, and widespread affordability crises. All of these populate this spatio-financial milieu that the students have been asked to consider. So the work you see today examines aspects of the city understood from within this milieu. So with that, I'd like to begin with the first 2 videos Both are focused upon accelerating current trends in wealth accumulation and investment practices.
Condominiums are increasingly sold before their construction starts. These sales, called assignments, are bilateral agreements to the price and visualization of the unit. The assignment relies entirely upon the virtual representation itself. During this time, the representation is detached from its physical actuality. The buyer, now holding the assignment, can resell the virtual unit. This poses no transfer of real property until construction is done. Here, the real estate transaction can be accelerated from months to mere minutes. The transaction itself moves into the realm of short-term trading. The units become discrete, virtual real estate assets. This entails the opportunity to speculate with real estate with margin. Their units compete for spots in physical actuality. At the transition from the virtual to the actual state, the units are assessed through the current value as VREAs. The unit with the higher value secures the spot, while the others will find a surrogate site away from the prime zones of the city in off-site locations. This scenario can be exploited through the simultaneous development of multiple building in the same lot. These lots will be prime sites formed by high-frequency trade zoning. Through amplified risk, the possible gain is maximized.
Well, I'm still fascinated by this. So I saw these projects earlier, when was that, like a month ago? 3 weeks ago. So well done, guys. They've really come a long way. Just wanted to say that to the students. But I saw this first, Dila's project here. I'm still fascinated by the kind of Parc de la Villette on steroids imaginary that seems to go along with a very dystopian future. And the kind of evocative and totally creepy sealed nature of these pencil towers distributed on an imaginary grid that only makes sense in that kind of abstract logic over the real city of Los Angeles. And I have to say, I find them super compelling in a totally creepy way. So I'm really fascinated by, on one hand, like a kind of a very sinister narrative and also very dramatic music, coupled with something that resonates as a form and as a new imaginary in the city at the urban scale. So well done.
It's interesting that the distribution that was just up shows how the pencil towers would get distributed through LA, and I think an unintended consequence of this kind of like Corbusier on Machiavellian steroids idea is actually to distribute wealth through the city of Los Angeles considerably more fairly than it is now. Like a lot of those points land through the southeast stretch of the city that, you know, when you look at how wealth is concentrated in Los Angeles, this is actually strangely a democratization of
but sealed into kind of dolmens, like
sure.
Yeah.
True.
So geographically more equitably distributed.
And to the degree that they are completely privatized and tax exempt and in every other respect, you know, brutally isolated from their context, I mean, they are deeply, impressively irresponsible urban proposals. But I actually do think that simply placing those assets, distributing that radical distribution of assets more evenly through the city is you know, has the possibility, has probably unintended consequences for urban renewal that.
Well, that's why I like the highly visible, even iconic nature of their distribution. Because I mean, if you're going to acknowledge that this is, as Matthew was saying, a radical, so we can't even adequately describe it as a radical shift, that's not even enough, then even visualizing it in such a way is a powerful move.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit just about it, and I'm talking fast and quick because I'm going to give up my seat, I hope, to Liam very quickly, who will do better with the rest of the afternoon. I've got to run. But you know, it's interesting to me how close it is both to Toyoto's weather towers and actually even more to the lightning field. The Walter de Maria project, that on a sort of, on the level of just formal rhyme, I think there's a power to the iconography. I mean, clearly there's a kind of Swiftian subtext to the premise of this studio that we're going to make these profound, unbelievably powerful forces in the American landscape visible. You know, all the examples they describe in their preamble for that project, and it's sort of true of the second project as well in terms of making those condos into fungible assets is the way wealth is made stealth. And I think almost all of these projects turn that presumption on its head. And this one, I think, does that first one does so in a really remarkably elegant way, and terrifying, but elegant.
Can we ask the students a question? They're here, right? Because what I'm curious about with the first project is what or whom is moving in the bird cages from tower to tower? Who are the students? You. So do you imagine that these are transportations for humans, or are these transportations for something else?
No, transportation for humans. And I'm assuming that those towers will be completely empty. They're just for investment, just like 432 Park Avenue in New York. So probably no one will be living there. But that transportation for public, for humans.
Okay, fair enough. But then it gets odd for me, the proposal a little bit. Because I thought you were going to maybe say, because there was this combination which was interesting with the Freeport. And one of the reasons why the Pencil Towers work in New York is that little chunk of ground which has been abstracted that is allowed to be extruded up. To spread that over an abstract grid, regardless of the economy of the ground in Los Angeles, requires some other economic incentive, which is where the Freeport idea, I think, is really interesting. But I don't know if I would ever think that this is actually something that people are going to then use as a transportation condition. So then I'm wondering what's moving in those bird cages. And maybe it's not people. Maybe this is not a transportation system for people, but a transportation system for capital. And if so, then it becomes oddly like a metaphor, unless there actually are objects which are of value to be moved and stored in these places. And then the narrative kind of breaks down for me. So it's a critique, because the moment we link this up with the bird cages, then the kind of radical weirdness of the abstraction gets almost normalized in a way, as if only by then using it somehow for another good in transportation for people, that would be the only way to humanize it. And yet the nihilistic radical nature of the proposal almost needs to get even more brutally, I don't want to say evil, but blunt in its sort of monetization of that idea. I don't know if it's...
Because it just seems that by turning those into a piece of infrastructure, it kind of undermines the premise of what you've set out to do, to say that these flows of capital that are largely sort of virtual in a sense, but then they have very real impacts in terms of the built environment. But it seems to me that move, I would agree, is the moment where it sort of undermines it, because you're almost building like an underground in the air now, and then presuming that people will travel to the cores of these buildings. If that is the case, if that's what you want to do, then I would actually really design the sort of experience of moving through that shaft, and why somebody would spend that time to enter into that whole system.
But I always thought there was something nice about the kind of the radical, the totally insufficient nature of these gondola thingies. That somehow they were actually symbolic, that they did stand as a metaphor, not for the movement of other things. I think that's totally cool. That could be really great to have them be, moving nothing around, I think would actually be the thing that makes the most sense. So the idea is that then they monetize that kind of 10% or 1% or whatever it is that you're required to give back to community goods. That always seems to go into, weird back entrances for like the poor people in these developments. So to me, it makes sense that it would be something that literally just gave the appearance, gave a value, a symbolic value, to something that is in fact part of making these things make money.
But I think maybe going back to what Joe was talking about, that if you're trying to make visible something that's invisible, one would presume that this would not result in a Jeffersonian grid, or an even distribution of wealth, but it would actually possibly be more sinister and highly concentrated and asymmetrical. So I think there's a kind of artifice of aesthetics that you could associate with De Maria, or a kind of interest in the Los Angeles grid, and a philosophical underpinning that you're projecting upon it that I think is not necessarily in the bones of the financing of it, which would tend to exacerbate the concentration. I love the montages. I think they're very provocative, and I think the difference, just the aesthetics of the two proposals, one which doesn't show us any photography with it at all, and the other one which primarily uses photography to construct the argument, I find that to be quite nice. But I wonder if there's would be a way into it that could be more subversive and maybe less well-intended and journalistic in saying that I'm going to solve the problems by distributing it. Because I kind of sense that there is that air of goodwill behind it, as opposed to saying, this is pretty sinister and it's going to make super dense shit, and I've figured out a way to make that habitable, as opposed to the music helps and the way you've shot it helps, but it's still like nice little, trolley cars going between things that presumably people are going to be okay with, as opposed to something that's, kind of like Hong Kong times 100, like that kind of concentration. LA lives on less than 1/3 of its footprint when these things come into play, because they galvanize more development around them or something.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. I wonder if the tower typology is at all, in terms of an asset investment, the right thing for Los Angeles at this point in time. Because it seems to me that even though the idea is that nobody is going to live there, right? Or the idea is you don't really need somebody to rent it out, because what you really want is to multiply your asset through the real estate itself. It still mimics the desires of somebody who would like to have a certain kind of apartment building in New York, in that case, right? So what works with the Venturi Tower is the selling points are you have the entire floor, you have huge windows, you have all kinds of qualities that we know that people look for. So the absurdity of the asset tower, the way I look at it in New York in particular, is precisely that balance. It's not to say, well, nobody is going to live there, therefore it can be completely something else, because it couldn't. It would never work, right? It has to tango in this bizarre way between seemingly functioning as an apartment but being so desirable by tapping into a particular condition in New York. It's maximizing the footprint of a block, going higher and giving one buyer one floor through with no neighbors, which is actually giving you the opportunity to dump your asset in there. So what would that be for LA, I think, is a super interesting question. I'm just not sure if it would be the same kind of typology.
I wanted to say I agree with that, and I also think that I don't know if these two are representative of the rest of the group, but to your point, David, like the question about whether these are choices or whether these are programmed into the pedagogy, that the pedagogy is already kind of accelerationist, I don't know, to bringing things up to absurdity and then to take things that happened in cities elsewhere and bring them into a city here. I think those are, is that your, maybe that, yeah, well, and so we shouldn't necessarily cast, I would say, choice there, but I think the question when it's asked, to my mind, asks maybe a deeper question about whether or not finance assets are sustainable as such, not in the environmental sense, like whether moving that model around the globe as it has been is going to actually find its sort of dialectical contradiction, like that at some point you will be building towers in places where they don't belong and the model itself will have to collapse. I think that was how I'm kind of reading this is why I just sent you that Nick Land thing, like that the politics here are not about normalizing the absurd but like pushing it to the breaking point in order to understand, well, what the resistance might be, if it's geography, if it's a certain type of asset that certain places can have and others can't have, then there might be a threshold at which we can actually see this thing producing its own contradiction. I guess in a kind of Marxist sense, like what would be the new form of financialization that contradicts this form of financialization so that we can...
I think that's an interesting way to kind of frame it, but I think that we should remember two things here. First, that the absurdity, we're starting from the departure point of absurdity, right? We're starting with absurd financial situations, and the thing that we're bringing to them is a weak thing, right? It's design. And so, kind of, we could look at it. So let me just frame it the opposite way before I answer like what I think is the answer to the problem that you're posing. If we think about kind of what happened to urban design when the decision-making processes that actually chose what the urban environment was going to be were all done before design got brought in. And so all the kind of beauties of form and amazing things that schools like this one specialized in started to become increasingly kind of in a problematic position because they become irrelevant to the actual decision-making process of the real urban world. And so when we can start to identify places where kind of bizarre new systems are starting to generate weird results on their own, the opportunity to kind of redeploy design, partially as a critique, partially as a kind of way to mess with the code, seems to be the only way to take any agency back for it. So then to turn it back over to the system, that the kind of question that you're asking about absurdity, what can design do in relationship to a preposterous financial reality that's actually building a world of its own anyway? It can conceal, it can reveal, it can characterize it, and it can situate people in relationship to it. And I think that in these instances, if those are the things that design can do, and obviously I just picked 4, and you can disagree with my 4, but if we take those 4, we can see how both of these projects are very much working on those games, like that the Jeffersonian grid with the tower, the inappropriate tower that shouldn't be in LA, on a grid, like the monumental tower, but a monument that's been dispersed totally without concern for where it hits the ground in LA, just on a grid that doesn't care what's at the base of the grid. I think it starts to do work about that situating you in relationship to this thing, right? It starts to, the making very visible what the parts that want to hide, but also actually still hiding some of the parts that ordinarily want to become visible about wealth. This project is playing against the internal urges of a financial system already by characterizing it in a built form. Really, probably more as a critique than as a serious proposal. I think the other one is also kind of, it's disjointing a process that was already disjointing people from the reality of the buildings they were going to live in by reproposing that it be materialized as the building that only the winners get to build on that site, that it reshuffles out the other bets that were less successful bets. It's an exaggeration, but it's an exaggeration of an already preposterous reality, right? And maybe it's almost a little dangerous because it's probably starts as a critique but ends up being almost totally viable economic proposal in itself. I think this is the danger point that we arrive at with this cluster of students is how do we balance the role of design as critique with the role of design as serious proposal in relationship no longer to a built environment but to a financial one.
I was kind of just taking off on what Ferda was saying, and insofar as that if you think about this as design not in the ways in which we're trained to think about it, but design as a form of sort of speculative experimentation where you run an experiment in a kind of in an imaginary way with imaginary outcomes and imaginary results. So you're imagining everything, it's still design, but what is revealed in each, let's say, assay is a certain kind of contradiction. So what I think is problematic for me in the way in which, how are we supposed to respond to that when one absurdity is layered on top of another? So if you have Di Maria and Jefferson and Jean Nouvel all combined into a package, it's really hard to know which one is doing the contradiction. So what I liked about Farida's comment, and why I'm kind of trying to push it further, is that actually it isolated the one absurdity, the first absurdity, that the student in a certain way never even made the choice, never even thought of it as a choice, because it was almost programmed into the whole thing. And then asking the question, well, when you move this model from one city to another, what happens to the model? What happens to the financing? What happens that if you just, so in a certain way, like there are just too many experiments being played on the same lab rat, so we don't know why it's dead.
Yeah, I agree with a lot that was been said. For the students, I guess I had hoped that perhaps the numbers game that's being played you went a little bit deeper. I think I want to say maybe the first one's not critical enough in a way, perhaps of what we know is happening and what I think was well described in Manhattan. But all of those examples in a market way have to do with limited quantities, right? And these studies, when you get deep into them, are fascinating to me. How many billionaires are on the planet? Limited number. One New York City, one Central Park, 5-7 sites creates this intensity, right, of that. That's why it's not in New Jersey or Newark, et cetera, in different places. This is very limited things. London is the great one, which is another absurd one, but that one, the opposite, where the manifestation of capital is not in our face, it's actually buried, which is kind of strange and weird, that these large villas are excavated underneath because there's nowhere else to go, and it's not lateral. There's only one of those neighborhoods in that area, again, very limited. It's funny, the Los Angeles example is actually Beverly Hills, and it's the single-family home, which is the 40,000 square foot single-family home being built, and there's a very limited number of people who can buy them, but they are lucrative and invested, and they make money. Because, again, there's one small neighborhood with a limited number of lots, and it has to be that area. That's why it doesn't happen in Azusa or Riverside. And so I think one kind of misses it a little bit when we just say, well, these things happen, now we'll just expand them over. I really like all the analogies and relations to other things in architecture that we know about it, and it's certainly a very powerful image. I just wish it was somehow either playing the game more intelligently as a way to really find out, okay, we know economics and form of cities are linked. When it's just at those who are interested in capital, it doesn't really make many interesting things, it just makes more stuff. How could we invert that and play another kind of game, as Eric starts to say, the formal perhaps, does it have a role to play in it or not? It sounds to me like this panel says it really doesn't have one, but it's worth looking at and seeing what we can come up with. So I find them both really intriguing.
You see, what I found interesting in the kind of research is that major question, what is the role of the architect in this? And I think what I like on that kind of work is that perhaps it shows that it was always the city who basically produced architecture, yeah? Which means there was something larger than the architect what types emerged. So the pencil tower, in a certain way, emerged because it emerged from a particular economic environment. The same was happening with other kind of buildings, yeah? So I think there is an interesting question, what's then the position of us, in regarding to this? And I think to identify, yeah, a new kind of building to emerge is already an amazing thing, because what it does, it gives you suddenly a totally new vocabulary within what the city is built. And I think that, to me, is the deeper foundation here. And it gives a history that I think, because I look at Sieder-Semlitsch, which was very intriguing when I remember I saw your work that you did in the Alps, a hotel in Switzerland. Yeah? And what was such an amazing thing is that suddenly, I think, I don't know how, you proposed a tower, yeah, in the mountain area, yeah? Or at least there was a tower proposal. And it was really interesting that there was a typology that you usually only relate to a certain kind of territory, suddenly, gets autonomous, and you ask yourself, what does that mean now that it does in the Alps? So does it mean that the territory has now the economic financial ability, or it would rearrange? And I think that's, to me, is the basis of the research, that, and perhaps my belief that it was always the city that might have produced architecture.
In that sense, Peter, I think another maybe important or interesting point is what would, in the first project in particular, do to the ground, right? By doing this sort of lightning field thing, the ground is just sort of disregarded to a certain degree. New York, of course, again, is an interesting example because, as we know, the grid was not a traffic or an organizational grid, it was an economic grid. I mean, Astor decided, we need to have a fair way of like land. How do we do this? We make a grid. And then the city fills in, and, it becomes like this sort of, landmark idea how the modern city has to look, right? 1920 is the metropolis of New York, et cetera. Now, the Pencil Tower is not only developing its own typology as a tower, let's say, but it is changing the bottom part of it, right? The grid is now suddenly Toulouse, or just weird. It doesn't fit. It's bizarre. And I think it's an interesting idea what that would mean to reconfiguring more urbanistically how these towers can bundle or come together and create a different kind of, ground level as well. So that would be a way of taking it to the next level. It's no longer about the asset management within the tower itself, but is there actually a potentiality to change, for better or worse, how the city underneath would function?
I think one way to get at least for me, what's interesting about the studio and the pedagogy of it would be to give students a kind of precision to balance design with finance, and that would have a kind of specificity. And I think this is partly what John was alluding to and maybe Ferda, but just to speak bluntly about the capacities of LA with towers, Eli Broad insists on paying for everything above grade. He won't pay for the foundations. So when you're talking about billionaires and what they want, because going in the ground in LA is so fucking expensive because of the seismic and what you have to do to make a tower, if you're looking for people to show off wealth, it is probably going to happen laterally, more like a mat somewhere in Beverly Hills. I think John's observations about subverting the mansion as a way of demonstrating wealth, the aesthetics of that, and a kind of precision about knowing how that would happen in LA, I think is something you could take away. Because if I'm critical of it, I feel like there's an argument being made that towers can happen anywhere in the geology and geography and the soils, and none of those codifications that drive wealth matter. And I'm not susceptible to them in a way that allows me to speculate kind of anywhere. And I think what would be interesting is that it actually digs into the ground and has to somehow reconcile wealth in relationship to the physics of the city's capacity, which would probably give it a very different aesthetic or way of concentrating itself, which could be Beverly Hills or other places. Or sure.
Yeah. But this is maybe where the first project can speculate usefully with the second project, right? Because you have this wonderful, bizarre collage of words. What is it? Virtual, real estate asset, right? Okay. So then in that case, there is an imaginary that is already at work, that is already formalized. These are images. There are images associated with these abstract units, right? They're often sold with renderings, with architectural renderings, and really creepy photography that actually could never exist. We discussed this a bit in my class. So you already have, there's already a formal imaginary that is divorced from the practicalities of something getting built, the geographical specificity, the geological conditions underground. And the amazing thing to me is that these things, just like that really old story by Borges where little bits of an imaginary world start to weirdly populate the actual world, still have a way of making themselves manifest, even in incomplete or fragmentary ways. So whether it's Tom Main's tower in Vals, or whether it's a skyscraper in London that has that is a ludicrous idea and yet somehow still gets built, there is already a formal and spatial imaginary that is at work and is powerful enough to occasionally manifest itself. So fine, I think it lays out on the table what Eric said so eloquently before, then what is the responsibility of design? What are the opportunities for design? How do those kinds of imaginaries, unhinged from things that used to bind architecture to specific localities and specific underlayments, specific soil conditions, et cetera, make new opportunities and make new problems for us today?
Do we need to move on to the next year? I find it my only hang up about that comment. I agree with most of it, but my hang up about it is how we have allowed ourselves as teachers of architecture to bracket out design from finance and finance from design as though those were not always already intermingled with one another. That the invention of, this is to your point, that the invention of finance required somehow design, and our very pedagogies of design are premised on certain kind of financial models, frankly. So even the very idea of a kind of the autonomy of the object moving into the Alps or what have you is based on a certain kind of presumption of speculation, not only from the designer, but speculation from the financier. So I actually think that the pedagogy is always already there. It's always already assumed by design professionals, as it were, that we're somehow speculating on the backs of a speculator. I think that this is one of the few programs I've ever seen that takes that as a fact and starts there. So you can say maybe all of the other pedagogy is a lie. Which is actually quite shocking, right? Like if you realize that only 10% of what we teach is actually, honest.
Well, last time I was in New York, I'm coming back to LA, driving over the Triborough Bridge. I turn right, and I see this pencil tower, okay? And it's completely dark, okay? And it's night. Not a single light is on except for the mechanical floors. Okay? I know because I've been researching it that it's fully sold. Okay, there's not a single property that hasn't been bought yet, right? And not a single light was turned on, right? As I was looking at just the surrealism of this, the strangeness of that. And perhaps it's even stranger how nobody seems to think it's weird. People go about their lives in New York, and, I guess they just assume it hasn't been occupied yet. I recalled an advertisement earlier on when they were trying to sell the properties, and in the Sunday Times magazine, and it was a full-page ad of a gigantic, very luxurious bathtub over a square, gigantic picture frame window overlooking Central Park. And I thought to myself, this is very strange, You would think once you get to understand the asset urbanism phenomena, why not just, why have any interior? It's just an asset, just leave it empty, unbuilt. You made the advertisement where you've rendered a possible luxury, but why is it even necessary to build it, right? But it is important to build it. It has to be there, even as a kind of potential for human consumption or occupation. Otherwise, it doesn't have the same value, So it just struck me as an utterly strange, completely new kind of destiny for design. And I thought maybe as somebody with a kind of formalist origin, maybe that's fine, maybe it isn't really about use after all, but that it begins and ends in the imagination, and then that's where it's most fungible, as an asset, right? So I think it's maybe important in the program, because this is really the initial stages of this discourse that we're trying to start in this program here. I think inevitably it has to start by just looking at the problem and putting it in a format where we can just see it, and inevitably it's nothing more than critique at this point. But as it starts taking steps towards something propositional, I don't know if it gets stranger or more normal, Maybe it gets even stranger when you have more numbers and more realism and more possibility, then it might become more bizarre.
But David, I think one needs to know what the problem is. One needs to define the problem. I mean, obviously, real estate is sold simply on the basis of prospect, but that prospect is already designed. That's one thing. I have to admit, it's completely out of my league. I don't know what I'm talking about, because I know nothing about the financial models that underpin the projects and basically the proposal. And I think you need experts on those things. You need, real estate investors. You need bankers in here in order to speak about the viability of these forms of speculation. And I really also think that, for an experiment to be assessed, the experiment needs to also be detailed to a certain level of specificity. Also, when it comes to possible design interventions and basically how one can speculate on something in terms of design, other than what becomes a more sort of polemical positioning of something where all one can say, or all I can say is, okay.
I think one dimension to the first project that I find really fascinating, just in relation to what David was bringing up, is the way in which it points to a kind of version. I mean, there's many ways to talk about the sort of phrase post-humanism, and probably many of those ways are a little worn thin by now. But this kind of financial post-inhabitation version of post-humanism, I think but that necessitates a kind of potentiality of inhabitation that facilitates the absence of inhabitation, this kind of dyad that I think we could call a kind of post-humanist dyad. And then I think it's no accident, of course, that it looks like the lightning fields. And then to think of the ways in which the lightning fields kind of are not about an inhabitation, of course, but about a sort of romantic sublime of some large naturalistic forces, or natural forces. And of an oil fortune. Yeah. Yeah. But I think that there's some fascinating resonances with the way in which there is a kind of narrative out there of the naturalism of capitalist logics, and that they are like the air, the oxygen that we breathe, and they're unquestionable. There seems to, Zizek would say, and many others, that there is a kind of absolute absence of an ability to think outside of it. It is so much of an ideological necessity, so it is like air. And then how does one operate in relation to something like air? And then the kind of sublime tendencies and this sort of romanticism and this new naturalization, I think, is an interesting thing that Dila is touching at. Super problematic in all the ways that have been brought up, but I'm fascinated by that kind of proposition in the work.
I keep playing this out in my head. We keep seeing this from the hills. What happens if we look at the hills? Are the towers now up in the hills? Are they the same height? Are they a one-story building in the hills? Because that would be the real fucking strange thing to see.
Yeah.
You go up into the hills, and it's a one-story storage shed.
Right.
On the most expensive piece of property.
Right. A penthouse mansion kind of thing, yeah. Cool. Well, I think we should why don't we move on to the next two videos? Unless there's, I think this is great. Oh, sorry. Yeah, can we give you the mic?
So I think it's really interesting that you came up with a financial instrument that you can't really trade right now because of a variety of reasons, that, including SEC regulations and so forth, but that maybe you could trade in the future on a different platform, like blockchain, for example. Because what you've created is an asset-backed security, which is similar to a mortgage-backed security, and the mortgage-backed securities could be valued according to instantaneous assessments of interest rates and the fact that it's generating income. So you could trade them quickly, which I guess is what you want to do. But to do it with an asset, I don't think, like, legally you could do it right now, and also because there's so many things that have to take place when an asset is transferred in the United States, like title searches and taxes that have to be paid, and local taxes and state taxes. So it would be very difficult to do what you're proposing, but I think it's an amazing idea, and it needs a different platform to do it on. And I think the blockchain would be an amazing platform to consider your proposal because of the transparency, the instantaneous ability to transfer the asset and the money that goes with it. So I'd just say congratulations, and I think you should think about pursuing it as a possible blockchain application project. I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
Thank you so much for the comment, and you've reminded me that I should have extended an invitation to the audience for any comments additional comments before we move to the next two videos. All right, let's roll the next two videos. So maybe I'll start. And start with the second video. So Yifan's project is obviously imagining a kind of future scenario that isn't that Airbnb itself kind of takes over the world, but that Airbnb, let's say, is an early foothills to a radically different type of relationship with property that is beyond Airbnb. And in that relationship is a kind of new, because all units are for sale at all times, that enables a kind of heightened degree of mobility, which I think, to be fair, of course, is a highly debatable proposition on Yifan's part. But I'm kind of curious in the kind of long history of kind of dreams, let's say envisionments of mobilities, right? A kind of no-stop cities, the sort of archograms kind of promise of the 60s and 70s, like how we might, and the clear kind of deliriums and pleasures of those fantasies, but the clear failures and absences. How we might understand Yifan's kind of envisionment of mobility in relation to that history. In what ways does it resonate? In what ways does it follow down similar shortcoming paths? Or in what ways does it find new opportunities in the contemporary?
Well, I think the problem with that, I mean, that was a really nice way to frame it, but I think the problem with that is that then you need a compelling vision. You need you need something that makes it architecturally exciting or graphically exciting or designy exciting or something. And I'm really missing that in that presentation. So if the vision is simply a kind of you can't have both at the same time. You either have to say, in the accelerationist logic, that what we know of the present, predicated on what we know of the past, accurately predicts what we can expect in the future, or you have to say that this is a speculative project that proposes some kind of alternative to what we can imagine the status quo will be based on what the status quo is. You can't combine the dreariest parts of the status quo with an expectation that then runs them out into an unrealistic future scenario that is neither inspiring nor has fostered any kind of design vision.
Well, I think there's also something odd about the proposal in terms of the idea that you would want to physically move all of your possessions, your material possessions. That with Airbnb, I mean, part of the reason that works so well is, I mean, the impetus for us to travel often has to do with kind of short duration events like this one where we're gathering in a particular location, and the ease with just kind of entering into an environment that's set up, staged, great furniture, everything's there. You don't have to kind of worry about bringing your own identity and setting that up and staging that. So I'm curious what kind of world, who's the author of Yifan? Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious, maybe, as we did last time, maybe you could just say a few words about who this sort of transient occupant would be. I mean, because it seems like there's a much different scenario than you're sort of using the Airbnb model, but I think there's a very different person that you're placing in the project, or non-human.
I mean, it's got that, well, are you going to say something? Oh, go ahead, you have a microphone.
You can say first.
You first.
Do you mind repeat your question, please?
What?
I couldn't hear.
I was just wondering, yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by it. I mean, clearly you've done a huge sort of amount of thinking about how this scenario could work. But the proposition, the moment you get to this kind of the large container, and then the drone and the individual and the moving of physical possessions, it's kind of like the conversation we were having on the previous one about the moment that the tower actually becomes infrastructural. I'm just wondering why, if all the units are for sale constantly, would there be a new model where you arrive and you kind of implement a kind of skin on the space through VR or something? Just, as an alternative to this idea of like heavy shipping. I don't know. Maybe that'd be how I would have proposed it.
I think going back to Matthew's questions about this, there clearly is, at least I would read, a interest on the part of the student in a kind of Fuller-esque archigram aestheticization of the machine here, which maybe doesn't map to the infrastructure that's driving those new models of mobility. I mean, in my understanding of this, it really premises itself on the legality of leasing. And WeWork is probably the front runner in figuring out how to do multiple leases in multiple cities with great simultaneity that allows you to live in 3 or 4 places at once. So I can sign on a year and live in 3 cities at the same time. It minimizes how much personal goods I need to take with me, which is, I think, to Marcelin's point. And it gives you, a kind of legal structure for how you sign or potentially purchase. I think there is still the question of who would want to do that and what would drive it, the desire line. And I think, I guess I wonder in this proposition if Airbnb is while it may be numerically the right model, although, the financing of WeWork is pretty potent right now. The desire trajectory of that is its hybridization of living and working with education, which is now the third arm of their model. And I think it presents a physical structuring of social networking through architecture that gives it a desire line that is almost like Facebook invented a new building through the section of those buildings or through the reversioning of the downtown athletic club. There's a way to restriate the floor plate that gives me a new lifestyle that I couldn't have had if I bought my own single-family detached dwelling or if I just bought a monolithic tower. And Airbnb, maybe it's too mobile. I don't know. I question, not to toss out the proposal, but I question whether Airbnb is the right model there if you are interested in techno-oriented forms of mobility that are maybe the people moving around, not so much the stuff. That is already kind of starting to happen as WeWork is maturing into its second and third markets.
I'm interested in how both of these projects connect to the long history of the relationship between architectural form and the lifestyles that it contains, right? And it seems like both of these projects have the potential to be suggesting alternative forms of lifestyle, or unexpected or new forms of lifestyle that we mightn't have seen before, right? Certainly for the last project, I don't know if we need to start to strategize a new infrastructure for moving all of our treasured belongings from place to place, but perhaps the thing it does suggest or question is the nature of what belongings might be, right? What constitutes a home in the age of the network? Do we need this stuff? Do we need a shipping container full of things? Or is the cabin baggage dimensions on a low-cost airline a new architectural modular? Is that more significant than how much stuff we can fit in a shipping container? Or in the livable city project, does the most livable city ever in all of human history mean that now, we move here and the birth rates explode? Because I don't know if there are real metrics between livable cities and birth rates. It seems like that's what you do in a livable city. You nest, you have kids, so now, like, do we move to this city because we have 12 children again? And I think perhaps potentially in these two projects, that's perhaps the most radical consequence of these propositions. Is not the architectural emergence of new forms, but actually the suggestion of alternative and new lifestyles.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely, I really agree with that point. I mean, on the livable, the sort of birth rates of livable cities, it sparked a thought in my mind, and it just maybe how to cross-pollinate the first two projects we saw with these two projects we're looking at now, and the kind of post-humanist story that we could tell about the first two, how that may or may not intersect with these kind of new lifestyles that you're talking about. I think one of the great paradoxes of the word livability and the way it's used and deployed in these metrics is it maps pretty closely to cities that have a lot of this kind of post-human, post-inhabitation phenomena, right? So like there's high degrees of vacancies and absences in the livable, the moments of livability. So it's almost the inverse of the birth rates. And so I wonder how that kind of, this sort of measurement of one thing and the kind of narrative of a certain type of lifestyle, right, and a kind of almost branding is a kind of cloak or a device that allows for something very different than it to happen. And so maybe we could even say the same thing about this promise of, or story of a kind of new type of mobility, whether it is or without goods. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the project, the particularities of moving all of these things raises a whole host of problematic issues, both conceptually and pragmatically. But I think this kind of exploration of, new lifestyles but anyway, this kind of stealth othering or saying one thing and doing the other, I think is quite interesting.
It's interesting having both you and Liam here at the table because both of you were doing work that made me aware of phenomena, very real phenomena that I wasn't aware of. And at first, I remember with some of the things you were pointing attention to, Liam, with network culture and some of the things you were presenting relative to asset-based architecture. Initially, I almost didn't believe it. Like, is this true? Like what you're telling me about these hotels in Ireland? And at a lecture Matthew was giving. And then I look into it, it's like, my God, it's not just true, it's even worse than I thought, And so there was a kind of, a little bit of a disconnect between what I thought was real versus what was in fact real, I guess, for lack of a better word. So I think one of the interesting challenges, I think, here of the program is first, you gotta expose the students to the phenomenon. This is happening in the world, right? And I'm sure the students also, as you were presenting some of these things to them, found it hard to grapple with, right? So probably most of the battle is just grappling with the reality of it. Then comes question, well, what do? We just do a project of raising our awareness of it, right? Or we come to some determination of what's the value of the outcomes we want relative to these constraints and dynamics, right? Which I guess would be more proposal-based. So I think what you said before, Johan, is right. I think this program is going to have to start incorporating some conversations with actual bankers and developers and urbanists and actually just begin to digest some of the practice of urban analysis, just to see how the logic is being constructed. Not that it's necessarily right, because I don't think the way things are done are right just by virtue of the fact that's the way it's done. But we at least have to see how it's done, And then we got to see what are the, where do we want to move it, right? So I think we're at the stage right now where I think really the battle here this summer was all right, what is it? And let's see it. Let's just take a look at it. And
In light of this frame that you just gave, David, I think I'd like to draw attention to one other aspect of how this pair differs from the first pair, which is, I think, of strategic interest to the way we frame the way we can answer this question. And maybe I could say it as something I was thinking about in the first pair in relation to something Michael was saying, that it's not just designed up against these financial realities. There's also that third player, which is a kind of structure, which in the first two is entirely legal and policy-based, right? It's the playing field, it's the board upon which the game must be played that the finance can't change either. But in this case, we can see that the structure isn't just a legal structure, and that's maybe a more traditional way of thinking about urban design. This is a structure that, on the one hand, in the livability indexes, is entirely arbitrary, made by journalists, who, of course, we know journalists have absolutely no economic power. And then, on the other hand, a kind of a restructuring being done through interfaces and technology that is also extra legal and in its operation, yet is having those kind of impacts that we previously associated with municipal governance and local legal structures, right? The typologies that were so successful as kind of like design's way of solving the problem on the plate that Peter was talking about before used to be very clearly like identifiable. Finance, law, come up with a solution. And I was thinking when you said that, Peter, it was in a period of about 4 years in New York when Calvert Vaux, Richard Morris Hunt, and William Ware invented the old law, the solution to what the old law tenement would look like, the solution to what the luxury apartment building would look like, and the solution to what the artist loft would look like. They all were invented by the same three architects, very famous architects, chairs of departments, who came up with the solutions that were imitated for 40 years in a million iterations. And I think that if we can answer the question within those rules, good, we know how to do that, and we could actually already do that within the discourse of urban design. But once we say that the rules aren't just about policy, but about all the forces that structure the way we make decisions about the environment, I do think it makes it more problematic. And maybe it was harder to move forward with these projects because they framed in questions that we know less well what to do with.
But both, Eric, I think going back to what you were saying about the last ones, and here again, if the game of the studio or the discourse of this unit is to basically suggest that not only does the ontology, we could say today the ontology's flipped. Design comes after the market, it comes after the technology, it's second in line to it. And part of the project here is to get it to happen concurrently, let's say. So it's no longer happening after and just visualizing what's been occurring or just developing awareness, but it's actually engaging the market. It's happening at the same time. Then I think there has to be some kind of pushback. I mean, both of these to me feel almost like knee-jerk reactions that really feel secondary and reinforce the ontological idea that those came first. Maybe there are things we need to be aware of, as David's pointing out, but if the game here is to move design higher up the decision-making chain, so it's no longer second to that, but happening and engaging it, then, this is interesting, but irrepolisses exist. Nylon Kong was a word coined in 2008 for New York, London, and Hong Kong, and no architect tried to take the typology from the three cities and their livability and basically morph it together into a mega block, right? I mean, to me, that's reverting back to a kind of secondary visualization of those forces as opposed to something that pushes it over its logical edge and results in something that wouldn't reinstate the financial or legal frameworks. It wouldn't reinscribe them. It would actually inflect them in some way that they wouldn't come out the same way. Which I think is an interesting idea for the program, but then it's, it has to not be enamored with those technologies or those financial systems or overly critical of them. I think it has to be kind of in a delicate space of subversion, that it's working with them as much as it's going against them.
I think in these two projects, I'm also really, I want to know much more precisely if these are meant to be complicit or resisting the issue at hand. They clearly seem to be complicit, but I wonder if it's a sort of an ironic and somewhat cynical complicity or not. Because it seems at first glance that they do lay bare the grotesque ideas through which we judge qualities, right? Like in the second project, if I travel to Florence, the last thing I want is to take my stuff there. The whole idea is that I'm in this fantasy of a different sort of world, right? And what, in my opinion at least, these kinds of pop-up rentals have done is it allows you to actually leave your things at home rather than to take them, right? So clearly it seems there is what I would see an irony in that project, but it doesn't really come to fruition, so I wonder maybe there isn't. And if there isn't, then I wouldn't know quite how to take that project. And the first one, again, these lists of the most livable cities, and to me, they're completely grotesque as well. And I mean, to take all the quality, because what it will do is, of course, to homogenize everything, right? And what we usually like in cities is precisely that they're not homogeneous, but that they have certain characteristics, right? So everybody will say they love Paris or Rome, and why? Because you can distinguish them from the other kind of cities. So to basically bring it down to data and statistics and numbers and then sort of reformulate that into some kind of a new urban city, it's a provocative idea, but to me it's within the range of commentary rather than a serious urban proposal.
You know, something that the way I'm responding to the work of the students just internally as I'm watching this unfold is when Matthew proposed making short films almost like infomercials as the outcome, I thought that's an interesting idea because as we're trying to transition now, right, within the program, okay, we first need to know what's worth working on, I think. You know? So, okay, let's look at 6 different very strange phenomena in urbanism today. And then we get these 6 films, and we have the next class here in the audience, you know. So next week we'll meet and we'll discuss what you thought of these problems. Because what I think might be an interesting outcome here is we then pick one of these 6 problems to really start diving in deep. Not just repeat the whole methodology again, but let's take one of these problems. If this year was about identifying the problem, next year we select one and start really drilling deep into it, right? So like, what do we have so far? First one was about, I mean, they're all the projects are about radicalizing some kind of undercover dynamic, right? So the first one is about asset-based architecture. The second one, then high-frequency trading of real estate. Then we have kind of the absurd hybridization of livability indexes. And then finally, we have the kind of Airbnb-ing of everything, right? And so all of them, because they're about accelerating it or radicalizing it, all of them will be preposterous on some level, right? Because all of these phenomena only exist in a compromised, insipid, almost subconscious level of operation. That's and by making it conscious, making it exposed and intensified, none of it's going to look possible, right? But at least it identifies the problem, okay? And so I would be very curious to see, I mean, as we move on here, which of these problems do all of you think are the most fertile and the most, provocative ones to investigate more deeply?
Yeah. I think just about all of them maybe to some degree, some of them less than others, but they have to do with infrastructure. So it's a financial infrastructure. Airbnb is a infrastructure in terms of mobility. But then again, the project ends up also being, it's not a fuller project. It doesn't revisit the typologies that basically addressed infrastructure in the 60s. It doesn't necessarily address the question of lifestyle. It doesn't address, for instance, the fact that Airbnb is a major factor for pushing people out of the city. So basically to live in the city becomes too expensive for most people. So I think it's very important to be also brutally honest and identify in what manner architecture actually, what one is designing. And to shift out of that picture, that aspect of architecture that has to do with, the ways that things look, the ways that things are seductive to lifestyle.
I think it's important to take the proper amount of time with it, because I don't think there's anybody in the world that knows exactly what the design problem is relative to any of this right now. They're just happening. Older ideas of design are persisting, and it's currently, I think, it's necessary for the older models to persist in order for these things to maintain this kind of subliminal state of being, right? So I think even if it was me doing the project, and I've seen some things, and I don't know what I would identify as the design problem. But I do think that's worth doing, even though we may not totally know what should be done. That's why I think we should do this, so that we can figure that out, So I don't think there is an answer right now, so we have to invent an answer, And we're also rubbing against the grain of real practices. So there'll always be a challenge of confronting an unreality of what we're imagining, So I don't think that's an easy. I think it would be putting too much responsibility on the students to expect concrete, authoritative answers relative to these problems. But I admire the kind of, all right, let's dive in and speculate, and yeah.
Well, I have only one comment to the two projects because they remind me to two things, and I agree to everything was said. One is that probably housing, in general, or occupation was actually urbanism, If you look into a history of the city, there was a gigantic, it was 90% was housing, so let's construct the cities for housing. And I think what is interesting here is the idea of housing as a problem of occupation goes away to as a physical thing, goes away to a time-based occupation. I remember I have this déjà vu from the 90s where the emergence of the network society, also in Greek now is debate about sociologists like John Urey, Giddens, on the question of time-based urbanization, the idea of tourism as a model of city, the idea of social bubbling, like in a shopping mall or in a how's it called, cruise ship, So this idea that I'm not occupying, and if you think about now, the recent text I read about that the city is a place of migration. So I remember there was one thesis work where someone asked themselves, how often do I change my living? And I think if you see that still today politics are made by owning something, the question here is, what if I don't own but still have an asset, but I migrate, Because everyone of us lives in millions of different cities and therefore cannot build up a certain kind of equation. So I think there's an interesting topic, how can you play asset and housing if you not own something, but definitely have to constantly occupy something, I mean, of course, it might be a totally different problem out of architecture, but that brings me to the more larger question about what also was the intention sometimes why architects did this kind of research. And I think when I remember, and perhaps this is my déjà vu of the 90s, yeah, when the idea was, you know, globalization comes and what is the role of architecture, it was the idea that research was done to more cultivate knowledge about the world. And it was not necessarily really a direct implication of tomorrow's practice. It only became because some people worked at OMA and thought I can make AMO as a practice, yeah? But the interesting was understanding the world, you know, and trying then to see what it does. So I think I would distinguish sometimes the part doesn't necessarily be implemented immediately, you know?
But I think what...
I think we might more typically expect, all right, we've learned something about asset-backed securities. Mm-hmm. Now, in a school of architecture, let's figure out what to design for asset-based securities, okay? I think it would be more interesting because things like an asset-based security or mortgage was invented at some point. And when I looked into it a little bit, architects were part of that invention, believe it or not, right? Because, like, for example, in the history of the mortgage, we talked about this. There had to be some assumption about floor plans and windows and, you know, what's a minimum occupation that we're willing to give a mortgage to, right? So instead of just figuring out what form we should give it, we'll do that too, of course. But I think it would be also interesting to invent something like a mortgage, invent something like an asset-based security here. You know, I think we can do that, right? So we may not know like what these new instruments are, but based on our investigation of it, why couldn't we hypothetically, if we then stay in that one topic, spend a whole year studying this, speaking to experts, and we invent a new instrument, and we show what it looks like, and maybe we have to suspend our values for a little bit. Like the ethics of it are unclear. Like the moment you deeply engage in acceleration of current practices, ethics will be uncertain. You know, but I think that's, for me, it seems interesting to approach it that way.
David, you bring in mind, you know, the Garden City was an economical invention. You know, it was not a physical thing. It was the idea of collective ownership. Yeah, you know, it was the idea of. I mean, if you read the Garden City in the first chapter, it was saying how to basically invest in that. It was not a form. Yeah, it was it turned then into something. Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't an architect, but it was just an inventor. But it is interesting that there was an economical model who invented an architectural project.
But I wonder if one of the ways to migrate into that second phase that you're talking about, David, and identifying the problems is to recognize that working with profitability exclusively is maybe not getting into that with as high risk as it could. So if you're mixing profit markets with ones that are nonprofit or aren't exclusively profitable, you could potentially see the Airbnb problem as a road in to affordable housing. As it not just lifestyle, not just embellishing the creative economy or things that we know to be profitable, but it could take things that are currently on the margins of profitability and make them have a profitable potential through design that could answer. And to me, that might be one way that you could, you know, kind of riff off of these highly profitable things that all the 4 projects that we've seen are identifying, but start to ask questions about where are the margins of that profitability and how could you shift that so it doesn't just accelerate the current trends of profitability, but it actually starts to throw some viscosity into that. And you might find answers that, like Airbnb becomes a new form of affordable housing. It's not just about mobility for the white, you know, creative middle class that has a reasonable amount of wealth and means.
Yeah.
Then I think it becomes even stranger and less anticipated and predictable in terms of how design's operating on it. And the politics, you could keep it completely a political aptitude about that if you could make it pencil.
Yeah, I think you bring in some economists and some bankers and some developers and put some friction against this stuff. There's a lot of assumptions being made, a lot of things, a lot of big generalizations like, oh yeah, you know, there's Airbnb in Venice and no one lives in Venice anymore, you know, and this happens everywhere. It doesn't happen everywhere. There's examples of it generating wealth in really interesting ways. I think it's just beginning to touch on some of the death of the hotel, you know, just as a type, for instance, is super interesting. But they can't, I think we're the wrong group. I mean, it's amazing to hear all you guys, but I really want to talk to a banker right now, you know, someone with money really investing in these things and saying, hey, that's something I hadn't thought about, you know. I think bringing that into the fold of the pedagogy and the people would help the projects, I think, get a little bit also more radical, perhaps. Not that they have to work. It's not this, I'm not saying this everything then has to be based in capital, but if you're going to look at it, you know, and you're going to take it seriously, you're not going to say, okay, this is bad. Although the second project here just gets so close to a really Marxist idea. Like you just basically said, is it your project, I think? You said, either no one owns anything, I think, is one, or everyone owns everything but has to share everything, right? This kind of total idea. That's an interesting political statement, but I have no idea what it means for architecture or whether that changes anything. It's just a little kind of different. It kind of ruins it in a way, because then I see she went into.
What I said the first project pedagogically is to deprogram the student. It operates.
Should we get a microphone for him?
Can we get a microphone?
Highly connected to ambiguity, which can operate architecture, which is meaningful to these kind of problems. Because they're so early focused in forming something physically, and since they're so kind of highly visually kind of oriented, it doesn't even allow them to start a conversation. Because I would have said you haven't even started a conversation. I totally disagree with it. A series of kind of very specific statements which you can agree or disagree with, and I would have disagreed about every one of them and made a claim that there's absolutely not true, starting with the Airbnb. In the first conversation, you would think urbanistically would have to do with its relationship of increasing the efficiency of found infrastructure, both the building itself and transportation and servicing infrastructure, which is extremely efficient. And then another one would have been an economic argument at precisely the time when urban housing is increasing globally. And you can rattle off your cities, they can do their analysis of the cities that they seem to prefer that are livable cities, et cetera. It's a subsidization, especially for certain demographic groups, right? That makes it actually more viable. And I would have come up with, but I would have started with an argument. And then you move from piece to piece, and I look at this one, and I think what happens, especially your age, I would have thought you would have got this one. I would have said, my knowledge of this project within the 20, 30-something generation is they don't have stuff. It's hugely changed the notion of the social cultural fabric of a huge amount of the population, especially young, educated, urban people. They don't have stuff. And then you're showing a solution, you go back and show a solution that's 50 years old. That was Craig Hodges' PA award in 1971. The first one was Super Studio, the point grid, which actually made no sense at all. I mean, it's absolutely, that'd be a whole other conversation. But it seems like you need to stop and to kind of really rethink the kind of urban aspect of this. And again, you're going to go from livable cities, but you never describe, is it actually spatial or organizational or an architectural or urban qualities that have to do with that? That's only one aspect, because I would have said Kreuzberg in Berlin, not so hot in physical ways, one of the most livable, culturally vibrant, right, cities in the world, and you wouldn't start with architecture, urban design. You would start with more complicated notions, right, of cultural, political, economic history, et cetera. But it seems to me it'd be really useful that you understand that you're shifting from one territory, and this school does it very, very well, and you're kind of highly articulate at a visual level and at a formal level. But as you're shifting, you have to completely kind of rethink kind of how you're working, and it requires a very, very different operational strategy, which is really forming the problem. And I think with that, which I think is so interesting about these projects, you are used to being given projects, and you're not involved in problem formation. You translate that problem, you concretize it formally, right? And you're used to that, and you're good at it, right? This one, you're forming the problem. You're not yet concretizing or forming it in physical terms. You're forming the nature of the broader meta-narrative. What is the project, right? And does it, by the way, even relate to form making? Some of these might have nothing to do with the development of form, and then you're spending all this time making these models like this one. It completely takes us away from the project. It's not about any formal quality. It's not anything you talked about. And we're trying to find the project, and it's it would be really interesting in these kind of projects if you need a law student and an MBA, because I find the same thing with my students. It takes a lot of work to get them to form an argument. They're just not used to that, right? And I can talk to a young law student, and that's what they do. And if they get lucky enough to work for the Supreme Court as a clerk, they literally sit down and make a coherent argument, right? That's where all your guys come from, right? From St. John's, those guys. But it seems to be really useful to kind of really, because it's really, I mean, you could argue this is the most compelling work of the 21st century. That'd be my argument for you, that this is going to be the most compelling work that's taking place in this century. And it's the most necessary. But it requires, I think, a real serious kind of rethinking, or that you do need, and it's moving to strategic, is what's happening, right? And it starts with some broad strategy, right? And it's highly integrative, and it's very, very, it demands a comprehensiveness that you're not used to, right? And it's probably the setup. It's not a studio project, number one. It's a deep project that requires kind of research that takes place probably a couple of years to get something done, right? But even then, the beginning of this should start up that research. Because if anything, some of these projects should stay with you for 10 or 15 years. That you could be looking at this and still working away on it, right? You're 35 or 40 and you're still kind of struggling with this kind of project that you started, right? Which has kind of this kind of scope. That's my comment.
That's excellent comments. Thank you so much. I mean, I think we should move on to the next videos, but I think there's a number of things that have emerged here, and I mean, there's no question in my mind that to develop this line of work further, the integration of expertise from the fields of finance, development, banking, all of that is a absolute necessity. I think this question of like what constitutes design in the face of these immense forces is an open-ended question that everyone's alluding to that really has not been answered. And I think it's an incredibly exciting kind of moment and topic to question what is design in relation to these things. And I don't think it is designing as we know it with the knowledge of these forces. I think it really is reimagining completely what design is. And I think I would just add one other thing. Like, I find incredibly fascinating the degree to which the experts, which no question need to be brought in, also totally don't have the answers in my experience. Even, like, I'm blown away at, I mean, pedagogically, of course, many schools have real estate experts, design schools, right? And then they've got their design faculty. Even in those environments, there's almost no conversation whatsoever between those two worlds. And when you talk to those two worlds, even when, and I've tried to have this conversation many times, in the same building, the real estate folks will be like, actually, no, I teach in design, a design school, but there's no connection at all. And then most of the design faculty also say there's no connection. Real estate finance experts that I've talked to, they're like, no, there's actually no connection. And I think strongly there is like an insane connection that is almost so omnipresent that even the people looking super closely at it cannot see, because it's so novel in some ways, but also so normalized that it can't really be articulated. So I think while we have to learn intensely from these kind of worlds of knowledge, we have to, I think, be very sure and confident of our own terrain around the knowledge of making space, and to build those connections. And because I think that's why to me it's very fascinating. It's not just an arbitrary term. I think this sort of spatio-financial logics is a really rich territory that is yet to be articulated. But thank you for this. It's great.
I mean, if I may, I know you speak to a lot of economists. I know you do this, and through some accident of fate, most of my friends from college are working on Wall Street. And I asked them a lot of questions, about some of these instruments. And there is definitely something to learn from them, because they're extremely smart, knowledgeable people, but they know something in a very narrow bandwidth, and they're absolute experts in something very narrow. And when I ask them very specific questions about, say, the relationship of a time frame to an interest rate, then they could speak for hours, right? When I ask them about a kind of general condition of maybe subsequent effects on a neighborhood in Manhattan, how do you think these decisions you made last year is affecting Brooklyn right now? And they utterly lost. I was like, yeah, who knows, and just throw up their hands. They have no capacity to generalize, right? And very little interest, too, And so they're practitioners, right? Their expertise is in a certain protocol, and I think we should learn those protocols. We should know as much as we can about it. But I don't think we should expect to get the big picture answers from the experts. I think that we have to supply, and I think that we can do also.
Great. Let's watch the next two videos. Let me just say, actually, before they run, so the first one touches on, let's say, the metrics of sustainability, and sort of proposes that, I think, in an implicit way, that it is itself an avatar of finance. So the kind of collaboration between sustainability and finance. And then the second is a kind of meditation on ghosts, Chinese ghosts.
That's it. On that note.
So you know what we were talking about with the previous set, this is to kind of pick up on that and extend it. I don't think in this kind of accelerated version of identifying problems and seeing how they play out that we should play the role of problem solver. I think that's where we mess up. And what we can do, though, is deal with issues of representation and scenario, and to play it out and see what that can be and what that can look like as an aesthetic situation. And I think both of these actually have an aesthetic stance that I find really interesting in the scenarios they're trying to play out. I wish this one with Monument Valley went in even more. I mean, we can always ask for more. But that last one, I mean, the moment you get us to laugh, and don't take it lightly, this is to the students. I don't know, who did these last two projects? Can you raise your hands?
Can you raise your hand? G? G, just raise your hand. You did the last one?
Yeah.
And Noel actually is not in town, so the other student's not here.
So the humor is not to take light of an incredibly serious issue. The humor means that you've actually struck an aesthetic nerve in us that makes us identify just exactly how absurd this problem is. The representation has kicked it into a terrain within design, both visually and in terms of scenarios, that we can begin to now think about and deal with. Not solve. It's not solving a problem. It actually becomes the aesthetic decisions that an architect engages as a designer to propose where those problems may lie. And that's where, for me, things get interesting. And we're done with the Airbnb thing, but to the Airbnb person, think about how everybody spoke about your project. That's not your project. Your project is not Airbnb shipping containers, which means there was a representational problem in the scenario that you put forward that didn't actually identify the problem for us to begin to engage. We're all talking about things we shouldn't have been talking about, right? Anyways.
I mean, I would completely agree. I was going to thank the author of the last piece for really testing out a way of using visual storytelling to combine with this kind of infomercial, some of the, rather than taking a stance of neutrality and almost like a pharmaceutical commercial, you're actually, there's a real sort of critical position, and there's humor, and it's being presented in a way that we're given facts, but then we're given these glimpses of, this kind of story that we begin to imagine. Really beautifully done. I think super compelling.
I want to also build on both of those comments, if I can, and just make the point that back to the false problem of the problem solving thing. Let's not forget that actually identifying a problem, the way we as designers identify problems, the way we map them, becomes part of the way that we're able to visualize how we address them. I want to make sure that we're not creating a false dichotomy between being diagnostic on the one hand and being and putting forth design proposals on the other. It took Hugh Ferris, for instance, mapping out the blank space that might be imaginable in a very simple set of zoning regulations to come up with an urban imaginary that in some ways is still with us. So just in the kind of presenting of the space around where possible scenarios and possible futures might be is already a deeply creative work, and it needs to be registered as such. We shouldn't separate those two things.
I want to echo that, but maybe in a different way, because to your earlier question, David, about which one of the problems, my choice would be the sustainability one. Not because of this project, although I thought the project was interesting, but because of the inevitability of it. There's something about a mortgage that's hard to believe that it ever didn't exist. It's hard now for me to believe that we ever didn't think that the planet was heating in a similar way. In a way, it's a horrible thing, whatever, but it's a wonderful opportunity. Not necessarily I agree, to just solve it, but as a place for testing scenarios, as you say, and through representation. So in a way, the Ordos project kind of is a given, and it's a limited and very delimited problem of vacancy that has kind of maybe even reached its apotheosis in the. But what's nice about global warming is that we don't yet know it's absolutely disastrous and imminent doom. So in that respect, I feel as though the representational opportunities it affords and the weird opportunities of misguided target practice, as it were, like I'm borrowing from the last project, the aesthetics and the beauty and the sensibility, and thinking about how it might operate not on a kind of already sort of resolved scenario, but in a scenario that has actual real ethical, political, life and death at its end. And I think that we wouldn't be smirking and chuckling, but we might actually that might actually have immediate consequences. So that we don't know what our values are, life and death, usually we pick life. So there it's clearer. I think that there are opportunities to pick death, but but this might not be, like total death might not be one of them.
I mean, I think these last two are interesting and compelling, but I have to say I am a little bit disturbed by something that's come up several times in today's panel, which is that somehow we need ulterior expertise to engage the problem. I think there's a value to commentary. There's certainly a value to journalism and narrative storytelling within architecture. But I think there's also an expertise that is emerging that doesn't use these models so literally. It actually subverts them for very selfish architectural purposes. And I would almost say what's emerging, at least what I would see as potential coming out of these, is similar to what happened in the digital turn, which is to say there was a kind of obsession and glamorization of a whole bunch of technologies that until architects could become very selfish and specific with how they were being used, actually gave more cadence to software designers and silicon graphics, you name it, that didn't give us more traction. And I think there are models, for example, that flip these things over. Like the shed, they didn't know how to fund it. Dila and Scafidio's project in New York City. So they spoke with financiers and they were brainstorming about it, and they said, well, you got to build a tower to fund the shed. But the shed actually came first as the concept. It wasn't, we're going to come up with a financial model to build towers. They actually came up with this thing, which was novel, had no purpose in New York City, really, as a kind of open platform of nonprofit cultural production. And the reason why they needed to come up with a tower to fund it was because they didn't want to have to deal with a board of trustees who would be financing the project because they would interfere with the cultural production of that institution. And so they used real estate, or they used a model of profit-based assets to fund it very selfishly, and did the tower next door to it. I mean, I think that's where, at least if you were to strike a line of what's happening today, that's where architects are becoming very selfish and subversive about how to produce projects that cities don't know how to accept or why they need them. So we're making a market, and then we're subverting a technology that's out there for our own selfish purposes, as opposed to suggesting that there's a market out there that we can visualize, and we have to bring in other experts to help us understand how to engage it. And I wonder if that kind of specificity, for example, in this project, there's a number of hints, mushrooms and other observations that this student is making about ways that you could use an existing system. But I wonder if there are ways of answering all of the infrastructural needs and things that drove issues going on in Mongolia for a civilization that's moving out of a migratory population into one that is now actually has a concept of property and has to deal with the assets related to that. Like, would that invent something different? I don't know, but I guess it concerns me that that we shouldn't underestimate the value of certain ways that architects are currently perverting the existing economical system to do things that are very selfishly architectural, but they're not autonomous. They're not, reinforcing a kind of idea of autonomous novelty. They're engaging the nonprofit, profit, they're mixing them up. And I wonder if that second stage of case studies or those types of things might be valuable in the next round of these projects.
But just to clarify, as I agree with what you're saying, but I just want to maybe be clear, because maybe I started this with about bringing bankers and economists into the discussion. The example you just showed, the way you described it, sounds like exactly what I would say was a positive outcome. An architect comes with an idea, hey, let's make this rolling thing that has absolutely no use at all in the city. And then someone says, hey, here's an idea how to pay for that. Make a tower, right? So, okay, so wasn't that a useful interchange?
But you didn't
figuring
need the
that out.
financier first. You're not emulating that
Absolutely,
model. You just don't know how to fund
absolutely.
it.
You don't
Yeah.
start with the money.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But one, to be taken seriously or to manifest things like that, oftentimes it's just a no-brainer that you would try to engage in that discussion and learn from them and
That's something
kick
you
them out of the
don't
room
need
when
to
you
do.
have to. But
Yeah.
you're right, it doesn't start there. But all these projects, in a way, start with a kind of naive observation about
An existing
capital,
financial system,
right?
a capital system. Yeah.
The last one I really like because it's a failed example. So it turns out there's also, the very, very first one we had was perhaps most successful, new, the Needle Towers, zombie hotels, whatever we call them. And the last being also the planet is filled with horrible examples of how that kind of thinking just doesn't work all the time. It's actually relics of these things that have to do sometimes with natural causes or the market, et cetera, which I think is also really interesting.
I mean, also, I must say that I think it's kind of a myth that the architectural imagination can come up with something from a void that then interfaces with existing logic and changes it. Because even the culture shed, a convenient example, that wouldn't have been hypothesized without the culture, industry, and economy, which already predefines the opportunity off of the financialization of the High Line as a real estate market of new ground, and it became a kind of obvious thing. So it wasn't like it was just invented nowhere, just in, Athena's brain, Athena's architect,
But the High Line is,
nobody
thought the
there
High
is
Line
no
was gonna
point
work.
zero of creativity, I think is my only point. Like, even that has a predecessor and an opportunity that was defined by other experts that are not architects, and if you keep tracing, it never ends. There is no point zero of origination, I think. So I myself, and this is a friendly disagreement we can have about this, I'm very skeptical about this idea of the pure architect's imagination, that's outside of all logics, that can reformat the logics of the world. I think our imagination is part of the world. I think it's in the world. We imagine things because of certain constraints that exist, I think, so.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting otherwise. I am cautiously optimistic about the work because I'm interested in seeing a level of precision in it, no matter what scale it's engaging those markets in the next stage. I think if what you laid out is that this is about finding these things, and I think the next level has to be a kind of exactitude of engaging them. And I'm wondering to what extent you can look at current models and speculate on them, ones that are maybe more selfish. But I totally agree, they're not coming out of nowhere or pure, which is why I'm saying they're not autonomous. Like, we certainly wouldn't want to go down that road again. But
Well, and let's not forget that one of the most spectacular examples of self-invented autonomy, the Peter Eisenman's Institute for Urban Studies, was actually financed in a pretty creative way by taking over federal funding intended to be used for the redevelopment of Harlem.
yeah.
An existing financial model ripe for the deeply embedded and highly devious architectural imagination of Peter Eisenman.
Yeah.
Completely on a different level. I think I'm wondering why we all like so much the aesthetics of the last project, because I would agree. I really appreciate, and like, this is such a great image right here, and then the one with the arrow, and it seems. So I kept wondering how much of the idea of the failed utopia, the vacancies of the cities that are new and yet old, and ruins before they're finished, and those kinds of things, sort of connect or lead to a particular aesthetic, which therefore is new or unprecedented, and from there a new kind of beginning to the end that you're mapping could be understood. I would really like that as a conceptual underpinning to the aesthetic that you're presenting, rather than just leaving it. And I'm not saying that's the case, but it's like all the other projects. To me, it's never really quite clear where they're going. Just leaving it as a commentary, right? That it's almost like a film that takes over a failed architecture, and it can only live as a film or an animation or a game, right? And I would love for it to be able to sort of come back in some kind of more specific, into a more specific architectural aesthetic.
It's interesting also. I also thought about the same thing. Why do I like this last one? And it is interesting because it plays with another thesis that always was embedded with the city, and that was the idea that the city, and I remember when Lowe said, starts with the idea to make a place, or to have a ritual, or to have something to which, for example, you gather, And so why we like them is because suddenly you see that in these places, there is a world, a new form of rituals, that could start to emerge. And I think that's where you suddenly see these other projects, that related so much to surrealism, that Kohlhaas then also promoted, which is you collect these weird stories together, and what comes out now, is another way of how we can imagine the project to live. And this is what is hilarious thing. These are they all exist, this story individually, but they are very much like a critical paranoid method idea. Collapse them together, and then you get this weird stuff out, And it's true, this is what we like. So there is what I'm saying is, even when it thinks documentary, it is methodologically, aesthetically presented. And by a kind of absence of anything beside only the arrow, which is, as Lowe said, or Hollein, the architecture starts when I put the arrow in the earth or dig a ground. It plays enormously with these cultures of our existence. So I think that's why we like it. That's why we like cities at all, because there is something happening.
Got something, Liam?
Yeah, you've mentioned and Freda just talked about it again, that the aesthetics of the representation of these projects. But I think what we're seeing less of, and potentially one of the most radical suggestions of this interest in finance, is the way that the material aesthetics of the actual architecture that's produced is also complicit or connected or springs out of these same financial interests in the financial powers of the city. Because I've been thinking about the connection between the last project, the Ordos project, and the first one, and I don't think it's actually, for me, the issue isn't about vacancy in Ordos, but it's actually very similar to the issue of the first one, where the material value of the architecture is actually in the fabric of its construction, that it wasn't necessarily intended as a city to be filled, it was intended to give concrete companies something to do, to give steel companies something to do. And I'm trying to think about how that relates to this condition in the United Kingdom now where copper burglars go into houses stealing pipes. When you go away for a 2-week holiday, you come back and you find that someone's gone into your house and hasn't stolen your flat screen TV, but they've ripped the copper out of the walls because the value of the architecture is actually in the material resource that it contains. In the same way in the MLS or real estate listing, there's a reason why we list marble countertops, because those choices, those material and aesthetic choices, are constructive of value, right? And most of the projects we've talked about look at architecture as a diagram, right? Like the blocks of stuff, just a pencil towel, which is really just an envelope. But actually, I think what's interesting is the way that the material substance of these things can also become part of our project. And we can be just as radical propositions, because the nature of those towers would be very different if they were built from solid marble or if they were lined with copper. The actual object itself, the material of the architecture, the way that we specify certain materials, is part of that financial system in a really radical way than just the enclosing of volume and space, right? So beyond the representation, the aesthetics of representation, I think there's really important work to be done in this space around the aesthetics of material, the specification of material, and in turn a question of form that is really fundamental to both what we do, but also how we can connect to some of these systems.
So this is not picking up on that, but I like it quite a bit. What I was going to say about these last two in relation to one of the larger issues of the conversations we've been having, and it's simply rhetoric. These last two do not put forward a set of data, knowledge, observations, and then attempt to provide a representation that somehow addresses that. Instead, they drop you into the middle of the record. An LP. You could drop a needle into the middle of an LP. You can't do that anymore. But it was always a great way to start a record. They drop you in the middle of a situation. The problem emerges from the way in which that situation is put forward by the designers of the films, the designers of the animations, the designers of the images. And the problems emerge from them. So we do not look for them as solutions. We look for them as speculations. And that's rhetoric at a very kind of fundamental level. How does one create arguments? And I think absolutely for a studio in its pedagogy in taking these kinds of issues on, you actually have to talk about rhetoric and the ways in which we form arguments and form discourse, and what are the ways in which an architect or an architecture can provide that kind of speculation with a problem, not necessarily to prove the visualization of data or...
I will, though, because I like Liam's comment too. I like yours as well. But
That's okay.
while you were talking, I got to think about what he was saying. And it struck me actually that in this program, the EDGE programs, because it's a year long, you can actually get to the specificity of a design down to its engineering, down to its materials, down to its cost. So over the course of 12 months, you can become as specific about a proposal as copper versus silver versus platinum. You can begin to decide where to locate value in a project. I actually think that's a really great pedagogical proposal for a 12-month studio, where, I mean, if the format here is no longer that we do 15 weeks, but that we're actually building on a set of proposals that then we test and then we continue, that there's the potential of actually getting to the moment where you actually know with some amount of certainty, like Diller and Scofidio did, whether the project will go or not. And always with the opportunity and with feedback from John's banker to like retrofit that into the process of the design. I think that's something that this is very unique format allows in a studio practice. It's very rare in a 10 or 15-week studio to be able to circle back that way.
Something that seems to me a little bit of a problem within that kind of question of like, what can we do with this model? Is how do we balance the attention to research, critique, and proposal in general with these projects? Like all the postgraduate programs face this in a way that the other programs don't. That we can kind of add value on each of those levels in a kind of design research method in this kind of critical mode, and then finally in the kind of usual design result of a concrete proposal. We don't need to arrive at the proposal in the same way here. Like I think that we've been wrestling with this all day. Like when is the research enough? When is the critique enough? When is it actually problematic to get too far down the line of proposal? I think like this has been a challenge for all of the postgraduate programs. This is the definition of Liam's program, right? How do you balance all of these things and keep them all alive and all in motion at the same time? And I think that's to me the year gives us the chance to get to where that's a problem, and it's a good problem to have, where we know we can accomplish something in maybe 2 out of 3 of these with any given project. But like having to find the best ways to deploy it has been kind of a really interesting question all year.
I think it's been a really wonderful conversation, and unless anyone has any pressing thing they want to get in at the last minute, I think, and also I extend this to the audience if anyone wants to jump in, but I think it's a good time to adjourn. I think it's been...
But before we do, just for my own need, can I ask the students that are here to just come up front and just face the camera so we can see your face and know who you are? Don't be shy. Come on up. Come on up. Missing a couple, but but good job, guys. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you for the great discussion. Thanks for coming. Have a great afternoon.